Okay, who's out there? Yes.
Once again, I'm out here. I have a specific question to Ken Hinckley, the first speaker this afternoon. You mentioned that you couldn't prove or evidence that NSAIDs were improving performance. My question is, I would probably not find that in humans either, as long as they are healthy with or without it. Could your investigation be biased by investigating only healthy horses compared to lame horses, unhealthy horses with or without bute? That's my question, because I'm a little bit concerned that you probably would improve if the horses had some kind of illness.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There's two answers, I suppose. My charge this afternoon was to speak about the potential for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs to affect performance in healthy horses, because that's one half of the question. Are you in fact conferring an unfair advantage on healthy horses by improving their performance, as can happen with the use of some other compounds? My assessment, and I provided a number of caveats and cautions, on the evidence at the moment, there is not, to my mind, there is not persuasive evidence of an ergogenic effect of non-steroidals in healthy horses. If we move to the question of the effect of non-steroidals in horses that are unsound to some extent, I think one could easily make the connections and draw the conclusions that that would probably act to restore or partially restore the performance of those horses to that which it would be if they were not unsound. Now, to date, there's a number of studies that look at various aspects of that question, but none that address it quite explicitly.
Yeah, I can also easily see the ethical point of view doing investigations like that, but to me it would be obvious to have some evidence on unhealthy horses too.
Anybody else? Oh, yes. Sven.
I have a question. I guess it's mostly to John Foreman. I'm a layman in this field. I'm not a vet. We have learned today, among other things, that inflammation is a symptom of that something is wrong in the horse, and further that NSAIDs tend to concentrate more in inflammatory fluids than in plasma or urine. So in light of that, what relevant conclusions can be drawn when comparing mechanically inflicted pain to pain as a result of an inflammation?
It's also an excellent question. One I get every time I talk about this model. I don't think there's any doubt that there is some degree of inflammation also going on in these horses' feet when the bar is tightened against their foot. It's not something I put on a slide, but I can tell you that in 23 years of doing this, not every year and not every summer, I have created 2 foot abscesses in horses right where the bar impacts, the tip of the bar impacts the tip of the frog. So I know I'm creating inflammation because I've had to deal with the after effects of that inflammation in those 2 horses. I don't think 2 in 23 years is a terribly high experimental failure rate, but it's not something I jump up and down and explain to everybody on first pass. So I do think we create inflammation in this model. Certainly there's mechanical pain as well, but I think one of the early speakers today addressed clearly that nonsteroidals have both anti-inflammatory effects and centrally active effects as analgesics, and so I think the model probably addresses both of those issues.
Yes.
My name is Ottaviani. I'm organizer and director of the International Jumping Riders Club. I have a question for Dr. Ken Hinchcliffe. I don't know sorry for the name, I don't know if it's correct. We spoke all the day concerning tests, and you test horses in a limited number, and for what I understood, racing horses. So we know that racing horses are 1, 2, and 3 years old. I don't know exactly. But the horses in jumping and the top-level horses that jumping in Grand Prix are between 10, 11 till 15, 16 years old. In Bonn, Professor Steve Maynard told me that there are two different animals. I would like to ask to you if you think that there is a closed link between the 1 and 2 years old horses and the horses that we use in the Grand Prix and that are doing a very different job.
Thank you for that question. One of the points that I wanted to make, and perhaps I didn't make it well enough in my presentation, was that much of the research that's been done around performance and the association of non-steroidals with performance has very severe weaknesses. The weaknesses include the type of horses used and the type of exercise study that or exercise that they were put through, the number of horses used, the outcome variables that we looked at. And I think I went through those in some considerable detail. I think we all share your concern that looking at 2, 3, and 4-year-old thoroughbreds running on a treadmill is quite markedly different to looking at a 12-year-old sport horse doing a 3-day event. Very different. And I urge, as I hope I did, urge a lot of caution in interpreting those results. So there's that caveat. But I think there are some physiological processes that are common to all horses, and if one is brave enough, then you can actually extrapolate from saying, well, there's no clear benefit of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs on performance in 15,000 thoroughbreds. It's unlikely, and those thoroughbreds would have probably been up to 10 years of age, some of them, not many, but some of them. It's unlikely then that it's going to have a performance effect in horses doing cross-country. Unlikely, not certain. So, it's a matter of trying to make the best of what's not a great data set. The point that I made at the end was if this is an important question to answer, then you have to answer the question you want to have answered and not try and extrapolate from small numbers and poor models. And I can just say I'm guilty of a lot of those studies that use poor models, so I'm casting the first stone.
Colin.
Thank you. A question for John Foreman. Could you clarify, please, John, in the recent work that you described to us, where you used what you've described as half doses of bute and flunixin, was your assessment of lameness in those horses on the same basis as your earlier studies, that is, that the horse was kept within the box? And if it was, do you think that if you'd been able, due to the experimental design, to take them out and assess them outside, you may have distinguished differences between gait in the treated and untreated animals for longer?
Yes and no. Are the answer to your two questions.
It does. Could you expand the second one, please?
The horses were boxed and not walked around, and they were evaluated similar to the earlier studies I described. So we've used that methodology straight through whichever dose and whichever drug we were looking at. When we have done a very limited number of studies, and again, from a welfare standpoint, I think you can appreciate the seriousness, the difficulty in today's climate of even getting a protocol signed off on in a university climate where you say, I'm going to induce lameness and I'm going to exercise the horses. Would be very difficult for me to sell to my, what's called an IACUC in America, an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So they buy it when they stand in the stall. They're not comfortable with the idea that I would take them out and put them on a treadmill. The limited number of times when we did that many years ago when it was not as difficult to get a study like that approved by the IACUC, we saw basically the horses that we thought were not 100% in stalls were also not 100% when they walked or trotted on the treadmill. So there's definitely a correlation, and we're comfortable with what we see in the stall being predictive of what we would see if we saw them move over ground or on a treadmill.
Okay, and is that because the initial lameness is quite marked?
The initial lameness certainly is marked, and we have to do that to be able to change the heart rates, to be able to have that be another variable that we can use in the model.
Thank you.
Pierre, you can.
I have a very simple question. I learned there is a delay of 12 hours between the last administration and the control. Who said that? Blah, blah, blah. Somebody said that. Okay. If you control 2 or 5 micrograms per mil, what is the plasma concentration 6 hours before?
It's a brilliant question.
I know the answer, you know.
Well,
the half-life is approximately 4 hours.
No, you don't know the answer, and my horse says.
No, of course.
I got the last of those data Saturday morning. So that means they were emailed to me Friday night in New York.
Okay.
So I have not evaluated those data
Perhaps
yet.
I can ask another way, qualitatively. It is higher than 2 or lower than 2? Or higher than 5 or lower than 5?
It will be between 2 and 6, based on other work that we've done.
So
when
the
clinical
message
effect
is,
wears
if you
off.
control 2 or 5, roughly speaking, it is higher 6 hours before, it is a full efficacious plasma concentration for phenylbutazone.
Thank you. There was a question up there. Yes, please.
Thank you, Doris Timmermann, Switzerland. It's another question for Dr. Foreman concerning the half dose, and I'm just wondering, I mean, all these products need to go to a licensed process, and they have an indication, and they have a dosage that should be used. And regarding to the fact what means it for the world around the FEI to give a sign of, or a signal of using half dose for a horse that feels, how you wrote it, like a little bit sore or something like this, that it doesn't really help to make it more clear. So maybe this really make it a little bit more not clear, like having a really indication for a reason for a medication.
Everything you've just asked me is above my pay grade. Those issues, basically you're asking how would the rule be implemented and how many medication forms and how would you prove what you put on the medication form. And the answer is that's all up to the veterinary committee to make recommendations to the FEI about and to change the veterinary regulations for FEI if it ever got to that stage. And that's not a process that I'm a part of, so I would leave that up to John McEwen and that crew to make those decisions.
We have time for one more. This is the last question. Sorry, we've got a break for coffee after this.
I'm Chris Hodson from New Zealand. I too am a layman, and I have difficulty reconciling, and I would not sure who should answer this, perhaps neither of the people who gave the papers. You might like to, Wayne. John Foreman told us the results of his controlled experiment, his model, as he described it, and indicated where the FEI guidelines, the new ones, might work. Fair enough. Tom Baragry, I think, told us that in actual field conditions, with degrees of injury, actual injury to horses, particularly in the joints, you simply cannot tell what the level is, or you can't reliably assess it. Now, are those two answers compatible?
Tom, you start on that.
I think what I indicated was that plasma levels, there will be a discrepancy between plasma levels and the biophase, the site of action where the drug is. And there's copious amounts of information and research generated in that area to show that the level in the exudate and the duration of the exudate can be quite high and quite long, and more so than in the plasma. So the general point I'm trying to make is that taking numbers in plasma at sort of therapeutic levels is not necessarily giving you a mirror image of what is actually happening in the body. That's what I'm trying to say.
I just add a couple of things there, Chris. So as a number of us have talked about today, you know, Lees and Higgins, way back, they did these carrageen in cages, which are areas of inflammation implanted under the skin, and that was how they showed what the concentration was in exudate. We have very little data in the joint, but your point is an important one, because what it is, as I think Tom mentioned, what's going on in the joint is critical, and I probably did enough on that too. So, and it's an unknown question. We've got very little data on levels in joints, and I think it's something that needs to be done. The second thing is it goes back to what's your functional activity with a certain level of drug, and that's where the pharmacogenomics comes in. In other words, I think ultimately we're going to be able to look at expression, and Tom mentioned this as well, look at the level of expression to get an index of how much activity is still going on.
So I think what I'm hearing is that John's model proves what it proves, but Tom is saying that in the field, to adopt John's recommendations might not be a reliable indication of what's actually happening to the horse.
Well, I just make one comment on behalf of, let John make one as well, because I think it's an important area. You've got to add back in the lameness factor, and the fact that in some of the studies that I talked about and John talked about is the disappearance of the lameness, or the reappearance of the lameness, the lack of response to the drug is still an important functional parameter. John?
I guess first I want to make sure that I'm not sure I made recommendations. You know what? FEI can do what it wants, and every last Saturday in April, I'll still show up on Rolex and help on cross-country day, whatever the rules are, unless we're doing something really mean. Whatever, I mean, so FEI can do what it wants with respect to this rule, this proposed rule change. What I was asked to investigate was what would be two different questions. One was, what would be the plasma concentrations of flunixin and phenylbutazone 12 and 24 hours after oral and IV use 5 days in a row? Now, we can debate whether or not those concentrations are effective or are effective measures of the drug's effect still. That's a whole sidebar debate. To me, the crux of the matter from my work, from the other question is, the take-home message is, the drugs are at those doses are not acting as masking agents and hiding lamenesses at 12 hours, which is the way the proposed rule, as I understand it, is written. So it should not be affecting a jog, should not be affecting an ability of a dressage judge to see that a horse is not sound in the ring. Now, as far as plasma concentrations are concerned, that's really a forensic issue with respect to enforcement of the rule and whether or not you believe the horse got nonsteroidals too much or too close to competition. But that's forensics. That's different than whether or not at that dose it will negatively affect FEI's ability to determine that a horse has been overdosed or dosed too close to competition.
I'd like to thank you for that. We are struggling to learn, and that has been very helpful for me. Thank you both.
Thank you, and time to break for coffee. We need to be back at 4:45, and please, once again, thanks to the speakers for this excellent session.